In the last video, you converted 2 out of the 5 to-do routes to be private. In this video, we're going to convert the final 3. The get by ID route, the delete by ID route, and finally the patch by ID route. Now the process for converting these is going to be really similar to what we did above. We're going to add the Authenticate middleware. We're going to update our query to take advantage of the new creator property, and finally we'll be updating the test cases. We're going to convert the first 2 routes together, the get and delete route, and your challenge for the video is going to be to convert the third, the patch route. Now, before we dive into any of this, we are going to need to update the seed data a little bit. We're going to be adding an authentication token for this second user, and that'll become clear a little later as we start updating the test cases. For now, though, what I'd like you to do is take the seed data file, grab the tokens array, and copy it down below for the second user. Now we do need to change the ID. Instead of user1 ID, we're going to pass in user2 ID. But with this in place, we now have an authentication token for both users. And we're going to need that in order to fill out the test suite. Now, by making this change, we've actually broken some test cases. We can figure out which ones we've broken and fix them by running npm test. It's just a few small changes, but it is going to be important to make these changes as well as adding the tokens array over inside of seed.js. Right here, you can see the 2 tests that are failing are the post users login tests. Should log in a user and return auth token fails, and should reject invalid login fails. We can head over to the server test file, move to the bottom where these test cases live, and we'll be able to make the changes necessary to get everything running. Right here, we have our describe block for the route, post users login. In this case, we log in with the second user. Then we make some assertions about the tokens array down below. We're asserting that the first item in the tokens array equals the new token we just got back as the response header, but that's not the case anymore. It's now going to be the second item in the array. So I'm going to put 1 right here inside of brackets as opposed to 0. This is going to fix this test case. It'll now pass. For the test case down below, we have a similar problem. This time around, we log in with an invalid password. We expect a 400 and we expect no token to exist. Later on, we check the tokens array, expecting the length to be 0, but in reality, it should now be 1. If a token was added, the length would be 2. We logged in invalidly, so it shouldn't be changed. The default length should still exist, and the default length goes from 0 to 1 because we've added this item. Now that we have that in place, though, we can rerun the test suite and all of our tests should be passing. This means that we can finally get started converting those 3 routes. Over inside of Atom, we're going to go into the server.js file and we're going to make some changes to this get by ID route. Step 1 of 3 is adding the Authenticate middleware. This is going to make sure a user is logged in, and it's going to give us access to the user and the token via the request object. Next up, we're going to need to make a change to our query. Here we call find by ID, fetching the to-do whose ID was provided in the URL, but this is no longer going to be acceptable. Currently, a user who's logged in could access someone else's to-do. All they'd have to do is specify the ID right here. They would indeed get logged in. Even though they don't own the to-do, they would be able to fetch it and see that data. What we're going to do instead is change find by ID to find one. Then, instead of just querying by ID, we're going to query by ID and by the creator property. Right here, we're going to make sure underscore ID equals the ID variable, and we're going to make sure creator equals the user's ID, the user who's currently logged in. Request.user._ID. With this in place, we can save the file, move into the server test file, and scroll up to the appropriate describe block for that route. Up near the top of the file, we're looking for the route for fetching a to-do by ID. We have that right here, and we're going to need to update these 3 test cases. First up, I am going to be grabbing the XAuth token line from a test case up above, since we'll be using that right here. For the first one, should return a to-do doc. Now the ID we're passing in is the first to-do's ID, and we know that the first to-do is owned by the first user. We specify that right here, which means over inside of server.test.js, we can paste the line in as is. Here we provide the token for the first user, which is the owner of the to-do we're trying to fetch, which means that we should get a 200 and our assertion down below should also pass. Next up, should return a 404 if no to-do found. In this case, we can go ahead and simply pass in an XAuth token just like this. This test case does not require any further changes. The ID is still not going to exist, and we're still going to get a 404 back. For the last test, it's going to go through a similar process. All we need to do is set X auth. This ID is not going to exist in the database. It's also not a valid object ID, which means we will get a 404 back. Now, there is one more test case I want to add. I want to verify that if I'm logged in as user 1, I can't fetch a to-do owned by user 2. I'm going to go ahead and copy our first test and paste it down below. Instead of it should return a to-do doc, I'm going to say it should not return a to-do doc created by other user. This time around, we're going to try to fetch the second to-do item. We're going to provide the second to-do item's ID, but we're still going to authenticate as the first user, which should cause a problem, and we should get a 404 back. We can remove our custom expect call right here. We're not going to get any body data back. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and rerun our test suite and make sure all of our test cases are passing. We should now have all of our tests passing. I'm going to run npm test to start things up. It's going to go through the entire test suite, and if everything is working as expected, we can move on to the delete route. Right here, you can see the 4 tests for getting a to-do by ID are indeed passing. So now it's time to go back into server.js and update the next route, the delete route. This is the last one we're going to do together, and the process is going to be very similar. Those same 3 steps. Add the middleware, update the query, update the test cases. First up, the middleware, authenticate, and second up is the query. Currently, we use find by ID and remove. If you remember from our mongoose remove file, there's a method called find one and remove. This is what we want to use. We don't just want to find by ID, we want to find by ID and by the creator, which means I'm going to replace by ID with 1, uppercase O, and now we can add our custom query in here. We're going to make sure that the underscore ID equals the ID that was provided in the URL. And we're also going to make sure that the creator property equals the request.user.id object ID. With this in place, the delete route has been updated, and now we can move into the test file to update the test cases. Over inside of server.test.js, I'm going to scroll down to the delete route. Here we have it should remove a to-do. Now for this test, we're trying to remove the second to-do. Currently, we're not authenticated, so what we're going to do is authenticate as the second user. That's going to require us to call the set method, setting the XAuth header. Now we're going to grab this token from the user's array. Instead of going to the first user, we're going to go to the second user. Then we're going to go into their tokens array, grab the first token, and pass in the token attribute. With this in place, we're now successfully authenticated as the second user who does indeed have access to the second to-do, which means that everything down below should still work as expected. The body should still have the ID, and down below, when we find the to-do, we should expect it to not exist because we deleted it. I'm also going to add a second test case really similar to this first one, which verifies that if I try to delete a to-do I don't own, it doesn't actually get removed. I'm going to copy this test case, and down below we can paste it. Right here, we're going to start things off by tweaking the to-do we try to delete. Instead of trying to delete that second to-do, we're going to try to delete the first, but we're going to do it as the second user, which should cause an error. Right here, we're going to expect a 404 back because inside of server.js, this query, this is not going to return any documents, which means this if statement is going to run and the 404 will get sent back. Back inside of server.test.js, we can now go ahead and remove our expectations right here. Although I am going to keep our custom function down below. Inside of this function, we're going to find the to-do by ID, just like we did earlier, but instead of expecting it to not exist, we're going to expect it to exist. The deletion should never have happened because I tried to delete a to-do I didn't create, so it should still exist in the database. The last thing we want to do before we run these 2 test cases is update the 2 test cases down below. Now these can be done with either user, so all I'm going to do is copy our XAuth line right here, which provides the second user's token. I'm going to paste it in this test, and I'll paste it in the test case below. With this in place, our delete test suite should now be passing. Over inside of the terminal, we can verify this by rerunning npm test. This time around, we should have 21 test cases, or one new one, and everything should be passing. Everything looks good so far. We're going into the delete section, and all of the delete to do routes did indeed pass. This is fantastic. With this in place, the last thing to do is convert the final route, the patch route, which updates a to-do. Now, in order to get this done, you're going to have to go through those same 3 steps. You're going to add the authentication middleware, you're going to update the query, and you're going to update the tests. Adding the authentication middleware will be the same as it was for every other test case, but the query is going to be a little different. Instead of using find by ID and update, you're going to need to use the other method, find one and update. Find one and update is going to do exactly what you'd expect. It's going to return just one item, which is exactly what we want. You're also going to need to update the query. The query is going to be in that first argument. Currently, it's just an ID. We're going to go ahead and set it equal to an object, specifying the underscore ID property as well as the underscore creator property. Now, once you have the server route updated, you can go ahead and update the test cases as well. Down below under the patch section, we have 1, 2 test cases. Both of these are going to need to get updated, and we're also going to add a third. Right here, we have a test. It should update the to-do. This tries to update the first to-do, which means we need to authenticate as the first user. I'll leave a little comment right here. Auth as first user. Now, once you authenticate as that first user, everything should work as expected. You don't need to change any of the assertions down below. What I'd like you to do then is duplicate the test above, duplicate above test, and try to update the first to do as the second user. Try to update first to do as second user. In this case, we should get a 404 back, and that's exactly what you're going to assert. Assert 404 response. Excellent. Now, once you're done that test case, you can move on to the final test case. It should clear completed at when to do is not completed. In this case, we are trying to update the second to do, which means you can simply authenticate as the second user. You won't need to change anything but adding that XAuth header. All the assertions down below can be exactly the same. So take a moment to knock that out. Feel free to use any of the previous videos or any code you've already written in this project. You can also use Google and Stack Overflow if you run into any issues. This is what real developers use. I use Google and Stack Overflow every single day when working on client projects. Take a moment to pause the video, knock this out, rerun the test suite when you're done. Go ahead and play around with it in Postman. Make sure everything works as expected. Then go ahead and click play. How'd it go? I hope you were able to get all of that done. We're going to kick things off over in the server file by modifying the patch route. First up, step 1, add authenticate middleware. Authenticate, boom, done. Next up, update the query. Instead of find by ID and update, we're going to use find one and update. This is going to let us provide a custom query where we can specify the 2 props we've been using for the other routes. The underscore ID prop equal to the ID up above, and the underscore creator property set equal to request.user._ID. With this in place, the route is now complete and we can move on to the test case. I'm going to save the server file, move over to the server test file, and kick things off by updating the first test. All we have to do for this one is authenticate as the first user. I'm going to remove the comment I left as a note. We can grab the XAuth token example from up above, paste it here, and simply change it to the first user instead of the second one. Done. That's it for the first test. We can now move on to the second test, which we're going to create by duplicating the first. I'm going to copy it, and we'll go ahead and give it a new name. It should not update the to-do created by other user. Now for this test, we wanted to authenticate as the second user. I'm going to change this from user 0 to users 1, but we wanted to try to update the first to-do, a to-do that we do not own, which means that what we should get back is a 404, just like I commented below. I'm going to remove the expect call and swap out the 200 for the 404. With this in place, our second test case is done. We can move on to the other ones down below. I'm going to grab a call to set, adding it to my clipboard. And for this test, it should clear completed at. When to do is not completed, all we need to do is add the auth token. Here, we're trying to update the second to do, which means I want to authenticate as the second user. I'm going to paste in the xauth call. I already have the second user right here, and we are done. There's nothing left to change. All we need to do is save the file and rerun the test suite. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to rerun the test suite. We should now have 22 passing tests, the previous 21 plus our new test. Right here, we have the delete tests running. Now we're running our patch tests. We have 3. They are passing, which is fantastic. With this in place, our users and to-dos are associated. All of the methods are locked down. There is no way to update, delete, fetch, or create to-dos that you don't own. You are going to need to be logged in for all of these requests, and you're only going to be able to manage data you have access to. Well, let's wrap things up by making a commit to save our changes. I'm going to run git status, and we have our changed files. Everything looks good here. I can use git commit with the AM flag to make a commit, associate users with to-dos. I'm going to make that commit, push it up to GitHub, and we are done for this one. There's 2 more videos left. We're going to be looking at how to properly configure our applications, pulling stuff like our secrets out of the code, and we're going to deploy to Heroku and make sure everything works in the production version of the application. That's all coming up next, so stay tuned. I will see you then.